Today we're going to begin our examination of the economic issues associated with migration. Now that we have a better understanding of some of the foundations of economics and how we measure an economy, as well as the uh, impact of international trade, we can get a better look at some of these issues that are affecting the world and how they affect a country's economy. So let's first begin with asking, what is migration? You might be thinking that it has something to do with the migration of animals. You may have heard of massive butterfly migrations or migrations of geese and birds. But in this sense, we're looking at migration as simply the movement of people from one location to another location. And we often think of migration of people as having to come from one country to another country, but it could even be within a country. Movement from one city to another city is also called migration. And you may have had some personal experience with that. So when we talk about the movement of people, there are a couple of terms that sometimes are used interchangeably. It really is just a matter of perspective. But an immigrant, with an I, is someone who comes to a country from another country. So for example, the United States, has immigrants from Mexico, or immigrants from India, or immigrants from Japan. An emigrant is someone who leaves a country that's destined for someplace else. So for example, in Japan, they have immigrants to the United States. The United States has immigrants that leave the U.S. and go to Ireland. So it's really just a matter of perspective as to whether we consider you an immigrant or an immigrant. It really has to do with, are you the receiving country or are you the host country? So just to give you an example of some of the issues associated with migration. The Rohingyas are a group of individuals in the country of Myanmar, and they are migrating. And this film will explain the rationale for that migration.
Often called as the world's most persecuted minority, Rohingyas are an ethnic Muslim group from the Rakhine state in Myanmar. The Rakhine area is Myanmar's least developed region, with more than 78% of the households living below the poverty line. About 1.1 million Rohingyas are said to live in the Rakhine region. While they trace their origin back to the 15th century, ever since independence in 1948, governments in Burma, later renamed as Myanmar, denied any recognition to the group and identified them as illegal Bengali immigrants. The Myanmar government's refusal to grant them citizenship status or any legal documentation effectively made them stateless. Under the 1982 citizenship law, Rohingyas were declared non-national or foreign residents. Since the 1970s, a number of crackdowns on the Rohingya in Rakhine State have forced thousands of them to flee to neighboring countries. During such crackdowns, refugees have often reported rape, torture, arson, and murder by Myanmar security forces. Some Rohingya Muslims in 2012 were charged with gang rape and murder of a Buddhist woman in Rakhine. The incident led to clashes between Rohingya Muslims and Buddhists, soon after which the Rohingyas saw themselves being evicted from their homes, their land confiscated, and their villages and habitations attacked by Myanmar's military. According to the United Nations Human Rights Council, more than 1 million Rohingyas have fled Myanmar since 2012 and have infamously earned the title the Boat People. As Rohingyas speak Bengali, they first headed in large crowds towards Bangladesh. Bangladesh hosts the maximum number of Rohingya refugees in the entire world. Bangladesh authorities were lenient, but with the rising number of immigrants from Myanmar in 2012, it chose to stop all kinds of assistance to Rohingya Muslims. Now the boat people headed towards Thailand. Thailand's navy gave the boat people food and medicines but did not allow them to stay on their territory. Malaysia adopted the same policy as Thailand and turned away the Rohingyas. To make matters worse for them, Indonesia also blocked all entry points for Rohingyas. With all doors shut on them, they turned towards India. India is home to approximately 40,000 Rohingyas, according to the Ministry of Home Affairs. They are said to have entered into northeast India through various routes. They avoided staying near the Myanmar borders and are said to have spread over large area across various states. They have their camps in Assam, West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, Jammu and Kashmir, Andhra Pradesh, and Kerala. The maximum concentration of Rohingya Muslims is reported to be in Jammu. According to the state government, there are about 5,700 Rohingya Muslims living in and around Jammu. According to the Government of India, Rohingya population has increased 4 times in India over the last 2 years. On September 5, Union Minister Kiran Rijiju asserted that Rohingyas are illegal immigrants in India and shall be deported to Myanmar soon. International organizations have appealed to India to not deport the Rohingyas. Amidst all this, Aung San Suu Kyi, the state councillor of Myanmar and also considered as the de facto head of the government, has been criticized for her inability to defend the Rohingyas. Myanmar's military and government have rejected allegations leveled against them for raping Rohingya women, burning their houses, and killing several other people of their community. Despite growing condemnation by international organizations and communities, the exodus of Rohingyas continues.
So in looking at migration, one of the things to remember is that we have an increase in the world's population really since the early 1900s. We have a dramatic increase in the population of the developing countries. As you can see from this graph, the area shaded in blue has remained relatively constant since the 1900s. However, the population in the developing countries of the world has increased dramatically. So when we think about migration, there are lots of reasons why people will migrate from one area to another area. It may be there's persecution, as we saw in that previous video. It may be that you're looking for a better job or better weather, better climate. Maybe there's something environmental that's happening in your country or your area, and you are being forced to move because of something that's happening to the weather. So migration is not something that is new. We have had migrations in all of recorded civilization. Obviously, at one time, there was a massive migration of people out of Africa and the Middle Eastern area. They spread across Asia, they spread across Europe, they made their way to South America and North America. That's the movement of people. We had in the Middle Ages the Greeks and the Romans. They spread across Europe and throughout much of Asia also. The Vikings, about 1000 AD, explored much of North America, in fact, as well as the North Atlantic. Even within the country of America, we've had massive amounts of migration. Um, Obviously, when America was founded in the colonies, um, individuals, uh, colonists, would migrate from one colony and they would, for example, head west. And interestingly, Kentucky played an important role in the expansion of the United States. Um, if you've ever been in eastern Kentucky through Cumberland Gap, Cumberland Gap is essentially a gap in the Appalachian Mountain and that chain of mountains that posed quite a barrier for colonists to spread west across the United States. But once that gap was discovered, and in fact Daniel Boone led colonists through the gap into Kentucky in the 1700s. And then once the colonists made it into Tennessee and Kentucky, then they could in fact go even further west. Obviously, if you know your history of the United States, there was, after Civil War, there was a mass migration of individuals from the south to the north, mostly because in the north that's where the jobs were located. Europe also had mass migrations, especially during World War I and World War II. There were mass migrations of people across the continent of Europe. So migration is not something that is a new topic. It is something that the world has dealt with and is a common occurrence around the world. So let's begin looking at some more detail about the economic impacts of migration. So how many people really are we talking about? By some estimates, we imagine that every year there's around 200 million individuals that are migrating, and they're not necessarily migrating from one part of the world to another part of the world. Many of them are actually migrating within the same region. And I'd ask you to consider why that might be. Why might an individual leave a country in Africa, which is a developing country? Let's say they leave the country of Ethiopia in Africa, and they move and migrate to Somalia, which is another developing, lesser developed country in Africa. Why would they choose to do that? Part of the rationale has to do with it's expensive to migrate. And if you're already living in a lesser developed country and you're forced to flee, you really might not have the resources and the wherewithal to be able to move to an advanced country. You may be lucky just to get across the border. So for example, in that previous video, the Rohingya, you saw the boats that they were using to try to flee to other countries. Those are not necessarily boats that will make it across the Pacific Ocean or even into to other parts of Asia and Europe. They can't go very far. And so many of those migrants actually are migrants within the same region. Many of the migrants are younger migrants, and they typically are moving from rural to urban areas. So think about, why might the migrants be really consisting of younger people? And the rationale for that is simply to move from one area to another takes a toll on a person. And the younger people tend to be healthier and more able to make the travel. Why are they moving from rural to urban areas? That's probably where the jobs are. So they might be moving from a rural area with no jobs to an urban area that has jobs. Increasingly, the migrants around the world consist of females. And this is one that you may not necessarily think of as understanding why the rationale for an increasingly female population. But unfortunately, in some places, the men are lost to the conflict, or the men are the ones that are engaged in the conflict, and the females and the children are the ones that are leaving a conflict. So in thinking about these individuals and their movement, we had a video which explored the notion of persecution. So essentially, you're classified as a refugee if you have applied for protection in another country and you have demonstrated that you do face persecution if you were to go back to that country. So right now there are around 26 million or so individuals classified as refugees. And Syria is the largest source of those refugees. Right now in Syria there's a great deal of persecution, and these are individuals who are fleeing the country because the government essentially is persecuting the people. And so they are fleeing mostly to Turkey. So Turkey is a country right next door to Syria. So they're hoping to get across the border into Turkey. They sometimes will move to Pakistan or Lebanon, which is, there are other countries in the Middle East, but really they're hoping to make their way to Turkey. And then in particular, if they can get to Turkey, Turkey has opened up their borders recently to allow people to leave Turkey and to make their way to the European Union, primarily through Greece. And so right now there's a massive flood of refugees that are trying to get into the European Union. So these are individuals that are facing persecution. If they were to go back to Syria, they would probably be killed by the government. So we also have what are known as individuals who are seeking asylum. So asylum seekers have to demonstrate that they're facing persecution, but they're still waiting to be granted asylum. So they haven't actually left the country that is doing the persecution. They filled out the paperwork and they're hoping that a host country will accept them. Refugees have made it across the border. Asylum seekers have not yet made it across the border. They're hoping to be granted asylum. And there are a large number of individuals who are waiting to hear about those requests for asylum. Germany is pretty much where most of those Syrians actually are seeking asylum. They will file the paperwork hoping that they can make it to Germany. If they're granted asylum in Germany, they can go straight from, for example, Syria or Turkey, straight to Germany. They don't have to wait in a refugee camp in Greece. There are also a large number of asylum seekers that have filed for asylum in the United States, and many of those are from Central American countries of Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico. And so they're trying to demonstrate that they face persecution in their home country, and they're hoping that the United States will grant them asylum. There's also a group of individuals that are known as forcibly displaced. In particular, these are individuals who might be facing human rights abuses. They might be facing natural disasters, that for some reason they are forcibly being displaced. And right now there are over 70 million individuals being forcibly displaced. So if we look around the world, most of the individuals around the world that are seeking assistance are those individuals who are forcibly displaced, and then followed by the refugees, as well as the stateless individuals. So you'll notice that where the individuals are being hosted, the largest proportion of them are being hosted in Africa and the Middle East. And it's important for you to recognize that they're moving from other African and Middle East countries to another Middle East or African country. That's the regional migration. So we also have another class of individuals who are called economic migrants. Economic migrants essentially are migrants that are moving so they can obtain a better way of life. And there are a huge number of individuals who would be classified as economic migrants, simply seeking a better way of life from where they now live. They're not necessarily facing persecution. They're not facing climate disasters. They're just looking for a better job, a better way of life. So this video will discuss the difference between refugees and migrants.
Another challenge lies in determining which migrants are persecuted people with a genuine right of asylum under international law, and which are economic migrants.
The problem is the refugee definition in the Refugee Convention is a person with a well-founded fear of being persecuted on account of their race, their religion, their nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion.
It's not easy to discern them, but we know that if people are coming from Syria, then they have the right to asylum in more than 90% of the cases, because simply they're fleeing from war. But we also know that when people come from Pakistan, or people come from some African countries, we know that they probably don't have the right to asylum. More than 80% are migrants, are economic migrants, and they don't have the right to stay.
It's one of the ironies of human rights law that you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and you look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both of them talk about the right to leave, the right of any person to leave any country, but neither of them talk about a right to enter.
So when we look at the flow of migrants around the world, we classify it as moving either from south or north. So this is not necessarily a geographic definition as much as it has to do with their level of development. So countries that are developing countries, we consider them south according to migrant flow, and industrialized countries are north. Now there are industrialized countries in the southern hemisphere. So for example, Australia is an industrial and advanced economy in the southern hemisphere. So when we look at the numbers of migrants, most of them are originating from south developing countries. Most of them are going to other south developing countries also. So for example, that might be the individual who's migrating from the developing country of Somalia in Africa to the developing country of Uganda in Africa. Interestingly though, there are some developing countries in the northern hemisphere. So for example, some of the Eastern European countries actually are facing a great deal of poverty, and they're really developing countries. They're not advanced countries. So for example, one might think about the country of Azerbaijan or Armenia. Those are countries in the northern hemisphere, but if you were to migrate from the country of Somalia, which is a country in Africa in the southern hemisphere, to the country of Armenia, which is a country in the northern hemisphere, that's called south to south. because they're both developing countries. If you're moving from a developing country to an industrialized country, that is called south to north. So if you are moving from Somalia in Africa to Australia, that's considered south to north, because Australia is an industrialized country. Now you'll notice there's a much smaller percentage of individuals going north-south from industrial countries to developing countries. So you might consider, for example, why do people not say, well, I'm going to leave the United States and move to Ethiopia? That would be a north-south migration, industrialized country to a developing country. Most people tend not to choose to do that. So when we look at the impact of migration, we also have to recognize, unfortunately, that slave trade still exists in this world. Right now there are anywhere from 12 to 27 million individuals who are really classified as slaves. They are primarily women and children. These are individuals who, for one reason or another, have found themselves in the slave market. Sometimes there is the idea of generational trading. Unfortunately, some families might sell their children simply because they need the money to survive. And that's an unfortunate aspect of things that are happening around the world. You also have individuals that sell themselves into the system because they're hoping to migrate. So for example, they may be promised a better life somewhere else, and a slave trader will take them on as servants and move them illegally into other countries and promise them a better way of life. Unfortunately, that pretty much doesn't pan out. Much of that promise for a better life ends up being in the sex trafficking industry. And unfortunately, slave trade, it does exist in the United States. Behind the drug trade, it's the second largest source of revenue, illegal revenue, in the United States. And so this is one reason that if you've ever been in a truck stop, oftentimes in truck stops you might see signs where they ask you to be aware, particularly of children who seem to be accompanied by people that it just doesn't look right. Something's wrong. Or maybe even an unaccompanied child. Sometimes the signage will ask you maybe to point that out to the cashier, and oftentimes the truckers themselves will kind of monitor themselves. I have known of truckers that will call the police because they've recognized there's another trucker in the truck stop that looks like there might be some slave trade that's happening. So unfortunately, this is a part of migration. So we ask about the economic impact of migration. Do migrants actually help the countries that they migrate to? They do help in many ways. There's a positive impact because of migration. So for example, these are individuals who are leaving a country, but they have maybe some business skills, in fact. They might be entrepreneurs. I remember my daughter working in the refugee camp in Greece, meeting individuals that were leaving Syria, and they were business people. And I remember her calling one day and said, "Dad, these are people just like you. They have ideas for small businesses and they're entrepreneurs." There are also individuals that they want a better job. They may just in fact want a job, and sometimes they will do the heavy work that citizens of a country don't desire to do. And so, for example, they may be willing to work at those industries that citizens of a country just choose not to do. So, for example, agriculture, construction work, even garbage, refuse collection. These are individuals, they want a job, and so they'll take that work. So, for example, in some of the wealthier Middle Eastern countries, there's a large number of migrants who are from Southeast Asia. So, for example, in the country of the United Arab Emirates, there are a large number of Filipinos who are working in the hotel industry. They're the individuals who are cleaning the rooms of the hotels. And they do benefit the countries that they are leaving from in that they will send back what's called a remittance. So, for example, those Filipinos working in the United Arab Emirates, they'll send money back home. And remittances are estimated to be upwards of $500 billion. That's money that's going back home. And so it might have a benefit on the country that they're leaving. However, there might also be a negative benefit. The country that's leaving might be losing their educated people. So, for example, the doctor that leaves the country of Somalia to go to another country, all of a sudden Somalia just lost a physician. Granted, the new country gained a physician, but the originating country just lost a physician. So that's the idea of what's called brain drain. Unfortunately, also, there is the recognition that with migration comes the spread of disease. You have mass numbers of migrants moving into areas, and they might be bringing diseases from that originating country into the host country. And because of globalization and because of the ease of travel, sometimes those diseases can spread very quickly around the world. So what we have examined today, we've looked at the trends in migration around the world. We've looked at the numbers and who these migrants are. We've looked at some of the reasons why people will migrate from one area to the other, as well as some of the economic impacts of those migration patterns. I also encourage you to please read the written documents that have been provided in Blackboard so that you gain a much deeper understanding of the concept of migration. But migration does have an economic impact around the world. It will impact the countries where individuals are leaving from. It will also impact the countries that individuals are heading towards.